Hello, and welcome to this talk. In this video on small group instruction for multilingual language learners, we will discuss the idea of small group instruction in a very general context. That is, I'll be talking about the concept of working with a small group of students in need of language support, and this can be applied to contexts from K to 12, whether you teach a content class or if you work with an EAL-specific context. So, why teach to a small group? First of all, it allows the teacher to keep instruction in the zone of proximal development. Let's take a look at the graph on the left. So here we see three circles. We have A, ZPD, and B. So A, in this case, represents the things that learners can do independently. The zone of proximal development, ZPD, is what they can do with support, so with scaffolds, with some teachers' help. And lastly, B would be sort of what's out of reach for the student in the present and what maybe is not the best target for learning at that time. So what we want to do is keep instruction within their zone of proximal development to make effective use of a small group instruction. Another point is that students may have different foundational skills that need to be developed, and this would be a primary reason to meet that group. And targeted instruction may be more appropriate with a smaller number of learners. So if you have certain learners that need to work on certain skills or that perhaps need more scaffolding than others in class, this is a very effective strategy to use. So there are things to consider when utilizing small group instruction specific to language learners. One of the first points we'll look at today is the proficiency level. So we'll take a look at CEFR levels, which you might see in PowerSchool, assigned to these students, and we'll kind of very briefly look at what those mean, and I'll give you some further resources or access to further resources to help learn more about those levels. We're going to take a look at learning outcomes in general, some skills being practiced, what to prioritize, and sort of what kind of products and tasks we might want to see. Now, if you're already familiar with running small groups or using small group instruction, some of these things might seem obvious to you. However, if you're new to small group instruction and are interested in incorporating it into your teaching, then these are going to be some things to consider when creating the groups and designing what kind of learning happens in these groups. I'd like to share a couple of quotes from the book Differentiating Instruction and Assessment for English Language Learners. First of all, English language proficiency levels in listening, speaking, reading, and writing influence what individual students can be expected to do with content. So this is true whether you teach a content class or an EAL class. The student's language level will determine what sort of tasks you can ask of them and expect them to be able to do independently and with support. So it's important we get to know that a little bit better. With universal design for learning, variations in student needs are anticipated and planned for. So once again, we need to understand what profile these students have, how strong their reading might be or listening might be. So the language skills and knowing where they are with those language skills becomes very important. So, considering targeted language support. The big idea here is language proficiency levels, which we've talked about. So groups might be formed based on language proficiency levels, and often this is the best solution when you're working in a language classroom. However, that might not always be the case, and we'll look at some examples of that later. It allows you to tailor the lessons to specific needs, and it provides a personalized and immediate feedback. So next, let's get into the CEFR levels that you would see in PowerSchool attached to multilingual language learners profiles. If you see the globe and click on it, you can see what CEFR level they're working towards currently. And just to be clear with that, if you see A1, that doesn't mean they've mastered A1. That means that they're working on A1 skills. And in terms of whether they're in a class or if they have a support like a mentor. So the CEFR, which stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, learning, teaching, and assessment, has 6 major levels. So A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. We can see sort of the step graph here. Beginner would be the A levels, so A1 and A2, whereas your intermediate levels would be more like B1 and B2. So the students that are identified as working on A1, A2, and B1 would be eligible for EAL support, or if they're in high school, EAL classes from A1 to B1, and once they've sort of mastered most B1 outcomes, and they no longer receive support, but they still benefit from universal accommodations. So a student that's been taken off support is generally at the B2 level. However, that's a little bit different from K-2. So I'd like to talk about scaffolded instruction, and the big idea here being differentiated materials. And sort of like focus on the input here. So provide leveled texts with visual aids and sentence stems. Okay, so those are easy scaffolds to incorporate. Ensure materials match language proficiency. This can be a little bit more challenging. So depending on what you have access to, or in your classroom library or what have you, this is also where we can really lean in and leverage recent breakthroughs in tech, such as AI. So AI tools are a fantastic way to both check the levels of texts to see what CEFR level they might correspond to. So you can plug in a text and ask it to AI to analyze it, and it will tell you this is probably a B2 level, for example. So then what you can do with AI tools is then I say, well, can you rewrite this, keeping the main ideas the same and the keywords as much as possible, keep them the same, and reduce it to an A2 level. And then you can really leverage these tools to modify and adapt texts or whatever source materials you're working with the class, and have them available at multiple different levels. And it's another way you could even scaffold for students, so they maybe are introduced to an A2 level text first, and then the same text at a B1 level, and see what sort of words they identify as being new, and there's all kinds of things you can do with that. So I will leave some links in the description of this video to a few AI tools that are useful for this particular strategy. And lastly, we want to use visuals, gestures, and simplified language in order to make content comprehensible for students. Now I'd like to draw your attention to a global scale, or a global descriptor, I should say, of CEFR levels. So we see at the bottom A1, A2, and B1, which again are the levels that we support most heavily within our school system. So I've included links as well in the video description and to the resources listed on the left here. So my language learning journey happens to be a document that EAL mentors and tutors would use, as well as some classroom teachers, to sort of work through the CEFR with students. So they're broken down by level and by skills. So you'll find speaking, listening, reading, and writing, descriptors, and some suggested activities to go along with those. And they are done by grade cohort too. So if you teach K, there's a K document. If you teach 6 to 8, there's a 6 to 8 document. At the high school level, there's the high school curriculum, which has more descriptors, so it's a little bit more detailed. And the last document link is CEFR descriptors for content classes. So if you are into a class where you're going to compare and contrast, you can kind of see what those expectations would look like at an A2 level, B1 level, and so on. So now we'll take a look at Social Studies Canadian Identities curriculum. So this is a grade 9 course, and here we see some GCOs, some SEOs, and we're going to look at this particular course, and actually it's GCO 3, 3.1. Students will take age-appropriate actions that demonstrate rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So this will be an example of how we can take an outcome in a content class and tweak the types of tasks that students are asked to do, and in order to engage with the outcome. So we're not changing the outcome at all, we're just taking their language levels into consideration and then designing the learning accordingly. So now we'll look at learning goals for that same course. Here in the small group instruction, designed for A2 learners, a group of A2 learners, we had the content goal, which is students will take age-appropriate actions that demonstrate the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. And we had 2 language goals in this lesson. So it was actually a multi-day lesson. But first of all, they were supposed to read about rights and responsibilities and circle those that they think are most important. Later, they were to write 3 key rights and 3 key responsibilities of citizens. So it's recommended in a content class to have your content goal, which you don't change that outcome, and then you have an appropriate language goal in order to engage with the outcome. In this case, the students, really we just chunked the sort of task into a series of progressive steps. So rather than just say, read about this and write a paragraph about rights and a paragraph about responsibilities, you're first reading it, you're identifying, they're then writing at a sentence level, that they're using a graphic organizer to put it together into 2 different paragraphs and so on. So one of the fantastic things about small group instruction is it allows for personalized instruction. The big idea being flexible grouping. So we can see the groups as being dynamic based on needs. It doesn't necessarily need to be a set group. That you can determine with what kind of class composition you have. So there are many variables there, but it could be as simple as we're working on a specific skill with the students that need to work on that skill. We can always adjust groups as students' language levels evolve, and we'll look at an example of something to consider just in a second. We're going to adjust the pace and content to meet individual needs, and it allows us to address strengths and learning gaps effectively. So we can have some groups that we might see more frequently because they're in need of more support and have more foundational skills that need to be mastered in order to engage more with the content that we're trying to teach. Let's consider flexibility with grouping a little more. So groups can be fluid, meaning that a group can target different skills and students may come and go from that group as needed. In the example below, we see a student's Spanish level, and this is broken down by listening, reading, spoken interaction, that is both it's sort of having a conversation. We'll think of it that way. Written interaction, like what you might do in a forum or through emails. Spoken production would be more like giving a speech, and written production, which would be more like writing a paper. In this case, the student's significantly stronger in reading than they are in listening. Therefore, although I would say holistically they would probably be recorded as a B1 plus level, which in our system we would call B1.2, they wouldn't really need a B1 reading group because they're clearly beyond that. They've already mastered B2 reading. So they could read any sorts of text that you might encounter in high school, most likely. Whereas it seems to be their listening is probably lagging a little bit because their spoken production is high. They can produce the speech. It's just that they're slightly less comfortable with listening, which is fine. The idea here is that the profiles are not always very balanced. So you'll have students that are stronger readers or students that are stronger speakers. And sometimes it's the skills that they may be weaker in that we want to target. Whether that's in a language classroom, but you might also take these sorts of things into consideration in a content class too. So one of the big pieces to consider is cultural responsiveness. The big idea here being building a safe environment. So we all want to create a safe learning environment. And what small group instruction does is it allows us to really tailor that environment, make it a little bit more safe, and a little bit less intimidating, and a little bit more engaging for individual students. So it allows us to include cultural experiences in instruction, and that could be something as simple as allowing student input to direct the lesson to some extent. So maybe using symbols from their culture, or maybe using things that are relevant to their culture in your instruction. To make learning relevant and engaging is a big one, and knowing a little bit about the students' backgrounds, and it allows you to have that time to have those conversations and to learn sort of organically about the students you work with. Foster a safe and inclusive atmosphere becomes all the easier when you have just fewer students at a time, and it allows you to encourage risk-taking and active participation. I know that my effective filter is way down when it's a smaller group versus a large group, and I think most people feel that way. So considering that we're using small group instruction as a means of differentiating, let's consider a little bit the types of differentiation. So if we're differentiating for content, we're considering the levels of texts, perhaps having the same passage available at different levels. We're considering the question sets, so we might keep the questions the same but change the numbers if it's a math problem. We might, or the complexity of the question itself, even if the operation stays the same, let's say. So how those questions are posed is important, and the quantity of questions. So do we really need to give students that need more time to decode and really work hard to understand the language the same number of questions as the rest of the class? So just take that into consideration when you are assigning these sorts of things. Process. So the methods we use, that is, are we using audio visuals, are we using gestures, all that sort of thing. The responses, Are students provided with a sentence stem? Are they expected to write a paragraph when they are working at the A1 level? Because that's probably out of their zone of proximal development, unless they have significant scaffolds such as graphic organizers, or it's really chunked heavily. The complexity of the texts they're engaging with, the complexity of the tasks they're asked to do is something to consider. What supports we offer. That could be things like manipulatives in a numeracy class. That could be things like dictionaries or tech tools. The expectations for responses. We've talked about that a little bit already, but again, keeping those sorts of can-do statements associated with the CEFR in mind. So the products are the big piece, or the piece I find the most interesting, and here choice boards are a great tool to use because it gives students, first of all, the choice, but also allows them to sort of engage in ways that they might prefer. So if they are more inclined to do some of the things below this, like posters or skits, comic strips, digital presentations, so having different options available for students is always a good thing, and it allows students to lean into their strengths. And we want to approach this as much strength-based as possible. So small group instruction really lends itself well to ongoing assessment. Big idea being formative assessment and monitoring progress. And it's a fantastic way to gather data on a group of students, and really the triangulation just happens very organically. So we're using observations and questioning to gauge understanding. We're providing immediate feedback, which is a huge advantage in this context. So students will be less likely to be embarrassed by corrected feedback in a smaller group. Again, you'll feel that out with your students. And their dynamics, group dynamics. So conducting ongoing assessment in smaller groups is a lot easier to take notes on 4 students versus 30, and regularly check students' progress so we kind of see how they progress. It's easier to keep track of that individual group or this individuals within a group than it is an entire class. So thank you for listening, and please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this and would like to know any more information about MLLs in your classroom.